So when you came to America, you decided, you went to the high school and school system, and then you decided to become an engineer, right?
That's right.
So why the engineering?
Well, I asked my father, who was my best advisor, and what he thought. My mathematics and science was always very easy for me, and he says, well, I think you should study engineering. So I said, what kind of engineering? He said, well, which one is the most difficult? So I studied electrical engineering in a very, very tough school, which was the City College of New York. And it turned out to be the right choice, because right when I graduated, we started having things like digital circuits and computers, and I was right on top of that, so that was very helpful.
That was in 1950s then?
Yeah, I graduated from City College in June of 1958, and I sent 2 applications, one to California and one to General Electric in Massachusetts, and they both jumped on me. I decided to stay around on the East Coast, and ended up on the West Coast anyway. Okay. Because my job took me from General Electric in Pittsfield to Sunnyvale, California. Mm-hmm. And then I started commuting. Right. And lucky for me, Boeing had just started flying these new things called jets.
Right.
Oh man, that was fun.
So Sunnyvale is now known as Silicon Valley, but at that time it was a defense really center there.
The big Lockheed plant.
Right. So what was your job there?
They built the Polaris missile.
So you got right to the missile systems right after college?
Well, yes. I was interested in inertial guidance because it was new, and it was something that I needed to learn. I'd never heard of before.
What is it? What was it?
What is inertial guidance?
Yes. To explain our viewers simply.
It's a technique which allows the guidance of vehicles in space, underwater, on the ground, without any external aids. It depends on a gyroscopically stabilized element holding 3 accelerometers, and the accuracy of the system depends both on how well the gyros maintain a reference orientation and how well the accelerometers measure specific force. So I guess the entire goal of this development under Doc Draper was to refine that to the point where we could hit something 6,000 miles away to an accuracy that I can't say.
Right. So there was no radio involved?
No radio, no, nothing. And of course, for the space missions, the radio was always there. And there was a big fight about, why do we have to build these expensive inertial guidance systems when we can track this thing with a radio? Until Doc Draper pointed out that when you go behind the moon, the radio isn't there.
Right, right.
So one of the main reasons for having an inertial guidance system on board the command module and the lunar lander was because couldn't depend on a radio. And the inertial guidance system did a fine job.
So what was your exact role and job first at Lockheed?
Well, like I told you, I was the mother of the guidance system. I went with it from Well, actually, I wasn't. I was a mother's helper because I didn't work for MIT at that point. MIT always had a mother to go with each guidance system. I was a mother's helper.
Okay.
Which meant I did all the work.
Okay. So mother was the brain. That's
Yeah.
what you mean, right? Mm-hmm.
It was, one of the young guys that wanted to travel, and he went with the guidance system wherever it went. In the early days. Later on, engineers from MIT, not me, but the others, also accompanied the submarines on their 3-month tours of duty underwater. That must have been boring as hell. I had my fill of being on a submarine, I'll tell you that. Because submarines are very crowded, but it was thrilling. Since we had to work on a submarine, while the submarine was doing its own thing, food was excellent, but they sent the thing down to what they call test depth, which is to make sure it doesn't break down under the pressure. Mm-hmm. And it was scary with all the creaking and all these sounds going on. Mm-hmm. And you had to sit there and eat your steak, just as if there was nothing to worry about.
So how long you were on the submarine? How much time you spent there?
On the George Washington, from probably March of 1960 until the famous July 20th.
Right. What is the famous July 20th?
Oh, we launched the missiles.
Right. Tell us about this episode.
Well, what's to tell? The missile is pushed out of the tube with a high pressure gas. It pops through the surface. Mm-hmm. The igniters ignite the engine, takes off. Yeah. And then the inertial guidance system will determine where it lands. Mm-hmm.
So where it all happened, tell us what happened on this day, where it was and why it happened that day.
Well, it happened on that day because we got ready. Mm-hmm. And
so where exactly were you in the world?
Well, I was down in the bowels of the submarine working, making sure that all the various things that could go wrong didn't go wrong. Right. And that was my job. It was to make sure that nothing went wrong.
But where the submarine itself was, in what sea?
About 100 miles offshore of Florida.
Okay, so it was by there.
Yeah.
And the test was successful?
Very.
Yeah. What do you mean very? How you define the success?
Well, I think it pointed out that the United States was regaining the perceived loss of technological advantage in a very clever and impressively dangerous to the enemy way, because the submarine was the first stage of the missile. The missile only had to go 3,000 miles because the submarine went 6,000 miles, and you could never find it. I mean, you don't know where it is. Mm-hmm. So of course, like always, the Soviets copied it and ended up doing the same thing. I don't know anything about what they did, but I think it's safe enough to talk about what I think we did, but not in great detail.
Right. Still. So you were down in the bottom of the sea you said you were just looking that everything goes perfectly. So what exactly were you doing there?
I was watching a little red light, which indicated the temperature of the system, because the gyroscopes and accelerometers have to be highly temperature controlled, because temperature is the thing that makes things vary, and they had to be very constant. So the care and feeding had mostly to do with maintaining the temperature to where it belonged and the voltages where they belong. and to make sure that nobody comes along and kicks the damn box and breaks it.
Right.
Because the monitor box was right in the side of a missile tube, and there was only the submarine could launch, I think, 16 missiles, maybe 8. This was the first one, and that was really the only contact you had with the guts of the guidance system, was that little monitor box that I prayed over.
And when it all happened, as you said, you were very proud, all of you.
Oh yeah. There's a custom in the Navy to put up a broom when you had a successful mission. It indicates a clean sweep. So when the submarine came back in, there was flying a broom on its flagpole.
Right. That's good. That was a really dangerous time in the world. That was, around that time was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world really was very heightened tension.
This was before the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But this...
But as I pointed out to you, that was also the time, or near it, when the president announced our program to land men on the moon, the purpose of which was to energize the engineers and scientists and the people of the United States and get them away from the lethargic reaction to the Russians are better than we are, because they are not. And I think from there on, with the other successes in the development of technology and with the success of the lunar landing program, the United States regained its dominance in technology in the world. And that was the goal, in my opinion. Now, I'm nothing but a lowly voter, but I think that was necessary.
Well, you were one of those engineers who was re-energized. And when we move now from this...
Well, I was young enough to be energized without any push from anybody, except maybe young ladies.
But when, okay, let's move now from this submarine to MIT. So how did you move to MIT?
Well, all that I've been describing to you, as I said, I was the mother's helper.
Right.
And in 1963, one of the best things in the world happened to me. I met Jenny.
Okay.
She worked in the Boston area as a teacher, and I was, at that time, in California. So I picked up the phone and called up my MIT instrumentation lab boss and said, I'd like to come and work on the Apollo program. And he said, how soon can you get here? So
that was 1963.
That was 1962. Because I started work in January of 1963. That's a whole other story, but I drove from Sunnyvale in my big white convertible to Iowa, Columbus Junction, Iowa, to get engaged to my future wife. And I used to go 75 miles an hour. And the closer I got to 50 miles an hour and 25 miles an hour. And then, after we got engaged, we were driving to our ski club, skied in New Hampshire. And we went through the worst snowstorm, bad enough that the car went off the road. It didn't stop me. I had chains, so I jumped out of the car and I put chains on, and when I got back in the car, my ear was totally frozen. It swelled up like that and kind of put a damper on our New Year's Eve party.
Yeah.
But that was that was it. And I've been very lucky because that was a wonderful opportunity.
So you got to when you got to the MIT then, so in what stage this Apollo program was at that time?
Well, pre-design mode. There were very few people that were hired specifically for the Apollo program, but there was a very talented and competent design group in place for the design of the Polaris missile guidance, and it was just a natural thing for these people to take on this other job too.
Apollo.
But all they were concerned with were the components, and the Apollo required a system, like new technology, optics. Well, Apollo guidance system was in 4 parts. There was the inertial measurement unit, there was the computer, and all the associated electronics, and then there was optics, because in space, if you lose the inertial reference, you have to regain it somehow, and the way you do it is to use a telescope, a highly precise telescope, to locate the direction to a star, and then transfer that to the inertial system so it knows which way it's oriented.
What is it, the inertial system?
Inertial guidance system.
Inertial guidance.
That's what it's called. The systems function were guidance, which means that when the rockets fired, the system had to make sure they fired long enough and in the right direction. That's called guidance. Navigation means knowing that you're here now and you're going to be over here later. Control means that when the rockets fire to orient the spacecraft, they don't go out of control.
Right.
So guidance, navigation, and control was the job of the system. And that involved both the instruments, the inertial sensing unit, the optics, and the computer, which interfaced with the astronauts who gave it commands in an interesting, very human way in terms of verbs and nouns. In other words, do this. You would enter a code that says point to star, things like that. So we started to put this thing together as a system. And my initial job was to conduct environmental testing on the emerging components of the system. We had to put them through vibration and shock.
So these were what, materials?
Well, they're the emerging systems, the structures and the instruments, and that's where I lost my hearing.
So that was in the lab that you worked.
Right.
So you were really doing the experiments.
Right. Initially, but then we needed a place to put all these pieces together and test them as a system. So something emerged called the System Test Laboratory. And
that was at MIT.
That was at MIT. And well, I evolved into the System Test Laboratory engineer. And got my picture in the papers with a lot of white coats and hardware. So that's when we got the hardware together, and we were able to conduct tests to excite all the error sources and to be able to measure the effects of these excitements. And that was great.
That was probably very ultra secretive work, right?
Not Apollo.
No?
No, any relationship to anything else we did, we didn't want anybody to be too familiar with. But Apollo was pretty much an open system.
Really, because to think of there was this space race with the Soviet Union, you would think that this is very secretive.
It wasn't. I mean, it gets very complicated very fast, but the biggest thing that drove the Apollo program was the fact that somebody had to build a rocket that was big enough and powerful enough to hoist all that stuff to the moon. And that was done by one organization under the direction of Wernher von Braun and his Peenemünde Germans. And then President Johnson, being from Texas, gave the responsibility of the system that was going to go to the moon to NASA in Houston. So we had this this need to work together with the people who were building the rockets, and yet work independently enough so that when a rocket did its job, we were on our own, and the rocket guys had to do it so that they couldn't care whether we were shooting coal or people into space. By the way, aside from anything, there's an excellent biography of Wernher von Braun by a guy named Neufeld in 1992.
Can you just explain that again? So they built the rocket, and you. So what was the component?
Not we. NASA at Houston had hired North American Aviation in Los Angeles to build the command module. We, with our contractors, which was General Motors and General Electric, Sperry, and Honeywell, built. We built the guidance system that would go into the command module and the lunar module, which just made my life very interesting because there was system testing going on, and we had to have offices and engineers in 4 different places. At North American, at Grumman, who were building these things, at Houston, and Cape Canaveral, where they were directed. And we didn't have anything to do with
the rocket.
With the rocket.
We were stopping there when you said one firm and one people built the rocket, and you put those guidance systems there. So can you explain it again? Like, so exactly what was your system doing in the rocket?
During the boost, it did something called boost monitor.
When it went up?
The booster had its own guidance system, and it was in charge. And the function of the inertial measurement unit in the command module, the lunar module was shut off, was as a monitor. In other words, the people who were watching the boost had 2 sources of information. One was what was actually guiding the rocket, and the other one was saying, yeah, it's doing it right, it's doing it right, it's doing it right. So that was its function. But then once it separated, of course, it went away. And then we had to do maneuvers like what we call a cislunar injection, which burns the the rockets on a command module to put it in a right path so it would interject the orbit of the moon. And
so that was your guidance system, just
right.
to make sure that the orbit, the trajectory was correct.
During boost.
Yeah.
And after boost, it was responsible for making sure it gets. Of course, people on the ground were tracking it with the radios and all of that, and making correction and all of that. Because as long as they had radio tracking, that was more accurate than a guidance system. It was there for the cases where there wasn't any radio tracking. And of course, it was there also for the control. I mean, when you were firing these little rockets on a spacecraft, there has to be something that keeps it oriented and makes sure it doesn't start shaking or start rolling on. And so the guidance system was guidance, navigation, and control.
So it's somewhat still like a brain to the spacecraft. So how many times it was tested before the actual Neil Armstrong mission happened?
Well, as I say in my paper, a system that actually flew was in a test phase for 1 year. And that was part of my job and the job of the people that work with me to make sure that it stayed, that it's the parameters that determined its performance stayed within the limits that they had to be. So it really boils down to before the launch, in a taxi cab, sitting next to Dr. Draper and showing him the data so that he would be assured that his hardware was capable of doing the job it was supposed to do. So I sat there and explained it to him, and
that was here in Boston.
No, that was usually at Cape Canaveral.
So you were there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about this famous first moon mission. You were at the Cape Canaveral.
No, actually, I was at Houston. Not at Cape Canaveral. I forget why, but
the command center was still in Houston.
I think the reason was that Doc Draper was at Houston,
right.
And I still had the papers.
Right. So that was the command center.
Yep.
Yeah. So describe this day? That was
the day
of the actual Neil Armstrong mission.
I really can't recall. I don't have a picture in my head. It was. I know it was hectic. There was a lot of data, and I, for one, felt a feeling of hope and helplessness. We're on our way. There's nothing we can do anymore. You either get there or they don't, and we've done our best.
But you were sure that your system works?
You can never be sure. We have established a set of measurements and established a set of limits to how much parameters can vary, and used best engineering to determine that if those conditions were met, it would do its job. But you can never be sure.
Well, it all worked, and the whole world was watching. So do you remember the picture when he actually stepped to the moon?
I was on the airplane at that time.
So you missed that?
No, I missed I saw it a zillion times afterwards. It didn't. But actually, I was pretty confident that the hardware, which I was responsible for, was rugged enough, and it was conservatively enough designed so it could take a little bit of a bounce once in a while, but the software is a different thing. I mean, we had never had something that was controlled by a computer program in a situation where human lives were involved. And that's where our glitch occurred. It was, again, a human and software combination that landed the spacecraft with 9 seconds of fuel left.
That was Apollo 13.
No, that was Apollo 11.
11, the first.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that fact, so that's interesting.
Well, I mean, we didn't carry extra fuel. I mean, but there was only 9 seconds left.
So how it happened like this?
Well, there was a landing. There was a rocket that basically fired to slow it down, so that it landed softly on the ground.
To the Earth, back.
Yeah, the moon.
Okay, so it was okay. That's because I'm not. So 9 seconds of fuel left before when it landed, when the famous mission happened.
Yeah, if there had been 19 seconds, somebody would have got chewed out. Too much.
Yeah.
You carried too much crap with you. That was pretty good, I thought.
Yeah. So, but okay, this was the first and famous mission. They came back to the Earth. But what happened with Apollo 13? You were also there.
Well, as you probably know, and everybody's written books and everything about it, the oxygen tank blew up. And there's a movie about it.
Sure.
And what powers the spacecraft is called a fuel cell, which takes hydrogen from one tank and oxygen from another tank, combines them to make H2O and electricity. And without oxygen, no electricity. So you had to depend on the batteries. So in the translunar trip, the command module was carrying the lunar module at its end, and the lunar module became the rescue spacecraft. So the lunar module, they went around the moon. The lunar module used its engine to push the command module on a trajectory back to Earth, and then those poor guys froze, because then they turned everything off. And when they got back close to the Earth, they had to live through the excitement of now turning everything back on and hoping it would work. But you know, the world was watching. Everybody was coming up with what ifs. If this happens, what do we do? If this happens, what do we do? If this happens. So their chances were pretty good. But as I pointed out, everything worked.
So where were you at that time?
I can't remember. I think I was probably in that room.
You showed the picture. So you were here in MIT.
Yeah, I think so.
And you said it was a very long day. I mean,
well, that was the first day. That was when it happened. It happened about early in the morning. I jumped out on with my 1957 Chevrolet, and everybody else too. We got together in that control room and started working.
Doing what?
Trying to tell Houston how much of a problem they had.
And how much of a problem they had?
Well, without a guidance system, during reentry, as I told you before, if the reentry is too steep, bad trouble because they could burn up. If it's too shallow, you start bouncing around the earth and you don't know where they're going to end up. It has to be just right to within a fraction of a degree.
And that was your component that really, the guidance system that really...
That's what the navigation, guidance and control system's job was, to put it in. And the radio guys, the radio was tracking it all the time, and it was telling us precisely where it was with respect to the radio system. So we didn't have much of a problem calculating that angle as long as the gyroscopes were working and they could hold the attitude to what was necessary. If they weren't working, then they would have to do it manually with all kinds of tricks, you know, lines on the windows and things like that, and who knows. But there were always backups, always backups.
So if something could have happened to the system, there was something...
Something else was already planned. That what if this, then that. Always a backup.
So you said you were pretty sure that they will survive?
To within human capability. And you can never be sure. So you're going to try like hell.
So what was the feeling when it all ended? Luckily, well.
I wanted to go to bed. It would have been the same kind of feeling if it hadn't worked that we had when Apollo 1 fire occurred. When you lose 3 people, basically because of malfunctions, that's bad.
So how long did you stay with Apollo altogether?
Well, from January of 1963 to probably the fall of 1970.
What happened then? That was when the MIT closed the...
My boss at the instrumentation lab gave me a new job.
So that was when MIT closed the lab?
Well, that went on. Didn't affect me, but when MIT separated from the Draper lab. I don't like to say it like the Draper lab separated from MIT, because we were bigger.
Yeah. But why that happened? That could have been such a star for MIT to have this lab there. Why they kind of...
I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I'm an engineer. Mm-hmm. I understand mechanical things. I don't understand human beings, especially of the female kind.
Yeah. And politics.
So I can't answer.
Yeah. So what was your next job?
Go back to developing guidance systems for the military.
And that was at the Draper Labs then?
At the Draper Lab.
That was 1970. That was really the height of the Cold War.
Yeah. Didn't pay much attention to that either. I mean,
but you knew that there's Soviet Union.
As an Estonian,
yeah.
I had, as I said before, I had a strong motivation for the United States to be predominant and superior to the Soviet Union. And in addition to all the other perks that I got from doing that, the satisfaction of excelling to the point where you are here representing Estonian TV instead of
Soviet Estonian TV.
Soviet Estonia TV, I wouldn't even be talking to you. But that was, everything else was nice too.
Right. So exactly what systems were you working on at Draper? How much you can tell us about that?
Well, I told you before, I was program manager for the development of what ended up being the Peacekeeper missile system. I had a job with the Navy to come up with ways to improve the accuracy of the, at that point, I think it was Trident guidance system. Not only the guidance system, the Trident weapons system.
What was the purpose of that system? Like in what kind of situations that system could have been used?
Nuclear war. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And my job, together with a whole bunch of other people, very smart people, was to come up with ways to improve the accuracy so that you didn't have to shoot as many missiles, and that they would become more militarily useful. By that I mean it's much better to be able to shoot something at the target and be sure that the target will be destroyed instead of shooting 10 and hoping that the target will be destroyed.
So how accurate those weapons were?
I can't tell you.
Yeah. But were you ever thinking that those weapons will be used, actually, the nuclear weapons?
We prayed, at least I did, because some of those were aimed at my home country. But the motivation to keep that particular evil out of this world was great.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. So a draper you were the rest of your career until like 17 years ago you left, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was already the time when the Cold War was over.
That's what they tell me.
Well, that's what happens in the world. So what was the feeling? America won.
Don't you think so?
Yes, of course. But you were working all those years for that goal. So what was your feeling when it was all over?
Well, other than having a great, interesting job, feeding my family, educating my children, and other blessings, that came into.
But you feel that you played a part in this?
Well, as much as any human can contribute as an individual, I think so.
Well, there were many people, but you were among them. But let's talk a little bit about Apollo. So that was also the space race going on.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also the component of the Cold War. So when the Soviets were the first to go up, so when the Apollo really started to succeed, what was the feeling here in the country and in your lab? Did you feel urgency to come up with this?
Well, we landed 12 people on the moon. I was there for 4. And then I considered my job done. Everything was in place, turn a crank. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, there was this one case where that didn't work. But we got around that. And I think if you read all the... Eugene Cernan wrote the last book, The Last Man on the Moon. And I think the answer to your question is in that book.
Right.
He was the last man on the moon. What was his motivation? How did he manage to get the job? But
so what he says, what was the motivation?
To be the last man on the moon.
But what I asked about the urgency was when the Soviets went up, then you really, everything was mobilized here to do the same for the United States. Do you felt like a pressure in the lab to succeed?
Our pressure came from our bosses in Houston. And their pressure came from their bosses in Washington. Mm-hmm. And their people in Washington's pressure came from the voters. Everybody's got pressure. But I don't know if anybody has a job without somebody expecting you to do something.
But you felt that the whole society was mobilizing for this?
hired 400,000 people, of which I was one, to accomplish something that this nation has adopted as a national goal, as stated by President Kennedy. That should answer the question.
To get to the moon.
First.
And you did it.
Me and 399,999 other people.
Right. But let's talk about the MIT lab. Like you said, you were doing all kind of tests. Describe some of those tests. So we're trying to be sure that the shaking and the explosions, and why all that?
Well, I'll describe the test that was conducted by one of my colleagues who was also working on his PhD at MIT. And he had the job of determining the initial orientation of the inertial measurement unit on top of the Saturn rocket. It's kind of easy to determine the initial orientation when something is sitting on the ground, because the Earth goes around nice and smooth and the gravity stays in one place. And we have a technique called gyrocompassing, which means that the gyroscope senses which direction the Earth is moving, and and by doing that, know which way is north. Now, the Saturn rocket and the system on top of it were way up high in the sky and buffeted by winds, so that the situation that you need to do gyrocompassing on the ground was complicated by the fact that it wasn't standing still. So some of the testing that we did was to take an inertial measurement unit and hang it from the ceiling like a pendulum, and then keep pushing it in all kinds of directions while we were calculating, using the output of the gyros and accelerometers, which way north was. And then using sophisticated techniques that were called Kalman filtering and other mathematical devices, then extract from all this motion the right direction. So at midnight, you could probably go into the system test lab and see George Schmidt standing there pushing this pendulum IMU this way and that way and calculating and watching. And he got his PhD.
Okay.
That's one example.
But tell about the test that you were conducting yourself.
Well, I consider myself probably one of the first applications programmers in the world, because the way the system was operating, there was a software group, ended up to be many people, and there was a hardware group. But at the time, if you wanted the computer to do something, you had to go and program it yourself in machine language. And my objective was to come up with a computer program that could be used to determine the functioning of the accelerometers and the gyroscopes in the system in a very short time. Now, normally that would take like maybe 12 hours. So I came up with a test that used the accelerometers and the gyroscopes to calculate the local latitude, because that would determine how fast the Earth was turning, and the value of the local gravity. And if they got that right, because I knew the latitude and I knew the local gravity, then I could say, okay, well, you can proceed with all the other fancy testing that was to follow. I did that myself. So that's an example.
Right. The computers are, of course, very different then. So how big were those machines?
Oh, geez. The cycle time in the Apollo computer was of the order of microseconds. Today, Christ, it must be nanoseconds or whatever. I mean, you know, you got this box there. We had 2,000 words of 14-bit memory that could be altered. All the rest of it was wired in. So when I talk about doing these tests, they had to be patched in to this 2,000 words, time shared.
Yeah. So that, in other words, the computer recognized 2,000 words.
No, the computer had 2,000 words of memory that could be modified.
Okay.
Everything else was wired in.
So the
And that
memory
was good. That was good because all the testing that went on for the other 36,000 words was so extensive that you didn't want anybody to monkey with it once you're done with it. You had to be, so you couldn't change the software once it was wired in. And that meant that nobody could go in there at midnight and diddle around with it and change something.
So it was set in stone there.
Right.
In the memory. So when you say wired in, what is it like for us non-engineers?
The memory was made up of what we called core ropes. I had one of those. I don't know what I did with them. Module about this long, this wide, square, would contain 2,000 words. And they take a little iron core, each one representing 1 bit. You pass the wires through it, which read whether the magnetism is this way or that way, and this would be a 0 and this would be a 1. And there was a whole bunch of old ladies at Raytheon that, you know, kept wiring, or young ladies, kept making these ropes. It was invented by a guy named Wang, who was a local entrepreneur and lover of the arts. I forget his first name, Wang.
Here in Boston?
Anne Wang, wasn't it?
Anne Wang, right. Yeah. That was the memory. Did I answer your question? No.
So it was pretty much a manual job.
Yeah, very much a manual job.
Okay.
And once it was in, couldn't change it except for those 2,000 words. And we did miracles with these 2,000 words. By telling the computer that something that's been wired in there is not right, so do something else and ignore this. And it's just absolute miracles were done with those 2,000 words. That wasn't my field, though. I was not. I did do the programming for the tests, but the programs that actually were loaded in for the mission were different for each mission. They employed hundreds to thousands of people for the test, and they were all assembled on a Honeywell 1500, I think it was, computer, which was as big as half of this room. And it was kept alive by Dr. Lanning, who, as long as I've known him, has always had a bunch of cards in his pocket, because punch cards were how you fed the information, and punch cards were how you got it back.
Right.
This all goes into antiqueness.